Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator Lieberman. You know, one of the best things about working in the Senate is the opportunity to learn and to know from colleagues whose statesmanship is an example for the rest of us. In my brief time in the Senate, I've had the chance to get to know Joe Lieberman and learn from him. He represents a view of America's role in the world in the tradition of Democratic leaders like Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, through John F. Kennedy and Scoop Jackson. In my every experience with him, it's been evident that Joe Lieberman is a statesman who takes positions on every important national issue because he believes they best serve our country's interests and values. So thank you, Joe, for your introduction, and more importantly, thank you for your example. I'm privileged to serve with you. I want to thank Brookings for this opportunity. I wanted to contribute today a few thoughts of the current debate over America's role in the world in this, the 21st century. And I wanted to give this speech today to share with you my observations as someone who has a long-time interest in foreign policy, but now finds himself in the role of foreign policy maker. Now, I'm always cautious about generalizations in politics, but until very recently, the general perception was that American conservatism believed in robust and muscular foreign policy. That was certainly the hallmark of the foreign policies of both President Bush's and of President Reagan. But when I arrived in the Senate last year, I found that some of the traditional sides in the foreign policy debate had shifted. On the one hand, I found liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans working together to advocate our withdrawal from Afghanistan or our staying out of Libya. On the other hand, I found myself partnering with Democrats like Bob Menendez or Senator Casey on a more forceful foreign policy. In fact, the resolutions I co-authored with Senator Casey on Syria and the resolution I co-sponsored with Senator Menendez condemning fraudulent elections in Nicaragua were held up by Republicans. And so I recently joked the other day that today in the U.S. Senate on foreign policy, the further you move to the right, the likelier you are to wind up on the left. And I found this sentiment to be true not just in the Senate, but back home as well. For example, many of my loyal supporters were very highly critical of my decision to call for a more active U.S. role in Libya. Now, the easiest thing for me to do here today is to give a speech on my disagreements with this administration on foreign policy. And I do have many. But I wanted to begin by addressing another trend in our body politic, one that increasingly says that it is time to focus less on the world and more on ourselves. Now, I always begin by reminding people of how good a strong and engaged America has been for the world. And in making that argument, I have been recently relying heavily on Brooks fellow Bob Kagan's timely book, The World America Made. He did not pay me to say that. He begins this book with a pretty useful exercise. He asks readers to imagine what the world order might have existed, what world order might have existed from the end of World War II until the present, if America, absent American leadership. Could we say for certain that it would look anything like America's vision of an increasingly freer and more open international system, where catastrophic conflicts between great powers were avoided, democracy and free market capitalism flourished, where prosperity spread wider and wider, and billions of people emerged from poverty? Would it have occurred if, after the war, America had minded its own business and left the world to sort out its affairs without our leadership? Well, almost surely not. As Bob persuasively argued, every world order in history has reflected the interest and the beliefs of its strongest power, just as this world order still largely reflects ours. Now, of course, many of these things were not achieved by us on our own. They weren't achieved because we succeeded in all our international endeavors. They weren't achieved because everyone always agreed with everything we did. And they weren't achieved because we were the most popular country on earth. They were achieved because the United States had a vision, the will and means to do the hard work of bringing it into existence and then of maintaining it. We had the will and the means to defend its norms and institutions and the security of our partners, face down its challengers, assist other people in attaining their liberty, keep trade routes open, and support the expansion. And we did it without coveting other countries' territories or seizing their assets or robbing them of their opportunities. The purpose of the institutions we established from the United Nations to the World Bank and the IMF, was to spread peace and prosperity, not to assert narrow American interests. Other nations consented to our leadership because they saw what the economic and political values of the American worldview had achieved for us, and they wanted the same for themselves. They followed us because they believed that our way, the American way, the principles of free people and free markets, was the best way to advance their societies. But as Bob also points out, we haven't ever really sought this role. And yet, despite our worries, doubts, and occasional resentment, we're proud of it. And we should be. As Bob Book highlights, a number of facts that are worth repeating here today about the post-World War II world America made. For example, the global GDP has risen 4% annually since the end of World War II. 4 times faster than the average in past centuries. 4 billion people, mostly outside of Europe and North America, have been lifted out of poverty during that time. The number of democracies in the world have proliferated nearly tenfold. And we have had the longest period of peace between the great powers ever. Now, before anyone accuses me of claiming that America has ushered in the biblical promise of a new heaven and a new earth, let's stop and remember that the world America made is better, but it is not perfect. But it is vastly more peaceful and prosperous than any other age in recorded history. So this is the world America made. But what is the role for America now? Is now finally the time for us to mind our own business? Is now the time for us to allow others to lead? Is now the time for us to play the role of equal partner? Well, I always start by reminding people that what happens all over the world is our business. Every aspect of our lives is directly impacted by global events. The security of our cities is connected to the security of small hamlets in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia. Our cost of living, the safety of our food, the value of the things we invent, make, and sell are just a few examples of everyday aspects of our lives that are directly related to events abroad and make it impossible for us to focus only on our issues here at home. The next question I'm asked then is, well, why doesn't someone else lead for a change? Why do we always have to be taking care of the problems of the world? Isn't it time for someone else to step up? And I always begin my answer to that question with a question of my own. If we start doing less, who's going to do more? For example, would a world order where China, at least as we know China right now, was the leading power, be as benignly disposed to the political and economic aspirations of other nations as we are? Now look, I still have hope that behind the curtain of secrecy that veils the Chinese state, that there are voices that advocate for the peaceful and responsible rise of that nation. Voices that reject the idea that global power is a zero-sum game. We hold out hope for a new China of tomorrow. But for now, we must deal with the China we know today. A China which enjoys its closest relationships with countries like North Korea and Iran. So at least for now, it would be foolish to be confident in the idea that China can be counted on to defend and support global economic and political freedom, or to take up the cause of human rights. By the way, the rest of the world has, especially their neighbors, have figured that out too. And they would prefer not to take that risk. The short answer is that, at least not yet anyways, there is no one else to hand off the baton to, even if that were a good idea. On the most difficult transnational challenges of our time, who will lead if we do not? The answer, at least today, is that no other nation or organization on earth is willing or able to do so. So finally, I'll be asked, if we still have to lead, can't we at least be equal partners with somebody else? In fact, shouldn't we rely on other nations to carry more of the burden? After all, we all know that they resent us telling them what to do, right? Well, in this new century, more than ever before, America should work with our capable allies in finding solutions to global problems. Not because America's gotten weaker, but because our partners have grown stronger. It's worth pointing out, by the way, that this is not a new idea for us. Our greatest successes have always occurred in partnership with other like-minded nations. Now, America has acted unilaterally in the past, and I believe it should continue to do so in the future when necessity requires. But our preferred option, since the U.S. became a global leader, has been to work with others to achieve our goals. So yes, global problems do require international coalitions. And on that point, this administration is correct. But effective international coalitions don't form themselves. They need to be instigated and led. And more often than not, they can only be instigated and led by the United States. And I believe that's what this administration sometimes fails to understand. Yes, there are more countries able and willing to join efforts to meet the global challenges of our time. But experience has proven that American leadership is almost always indispensable to its success. You can see this in the actions of, or sometimes lack thereof, of the World Trade Organization or the UN Security Council. And when American influence is diminished, for example, by the one nation, one vote formula of the UN General Assembly or the UN Human Rights Council, we see absurd and often appalling results. Multilateral international organizations can be a forum for forming international coalitions. But as we have repeatedly seen over the last few years, the more difficult the problem, the likelier bad actors will spoil meaningful solutions within the current system of international organizations. For example, we can't always rely on the UN Security Council to achieve consensus on major threats to international peace and security, as we've seen on North